Now everyone's heard of screening and using screening products, screening plantings, can screen hunter access, screen bedding areas, and also, real importantly, screen your food sources. Now there's some obvious things with screening a food source. Obviously the deer, if this entire food source right here is screened properly, and I'm talking a height of at least 6-7 foot, and deer can't see in, you can't see out, vice versa, they can't see hunters, hunters can't see them, then there's a lot of benefits to that. For one, they feel very safe to be in here. That's the obvious. A little bit less obvious things is, you know, of course, if this is screened, then I can effectively get into a stand like this one back here. We have a redneck ghillie right over here. We can get in and out of those blinds, not spook the deer that are out here. Could have 20 deer, and I always take that approach that, sure, it's great to hunt by a food source that's 1.25 acres like this, but if you can't get in and out of your stands around this food plot without spooking deer that are on it, either when you enter the stand or blind location or when you exit after dark or during the morning, then changes have to be made. A lot of times it boils down to screening. So hunter access, getting into adjacent blinds, stands is a great tool for a great strategy for using screening. Some less obvious ones. One of the things that some will focus on is, and I like to focus on, is that if there's a mature buck that's going across this knoll over here from 50 yards back, 75 yards back, let alone if he's out there in the field 100 yards away from the food plot on this side, he doesn't even have to come out in this food. So you're trying to use this food to direct traffic and use an attraction to actually pull deer into this area, when really, without the screening around this food plot, whether you're hinge cutting and creating that feathered edge, whether you're using Egyptian weed or whether you're using screening cover, like, or screening plantings, grasses, like native grasses, like a switchgrass, which I strongly recommend, then he can just sit back here 100 yards. He doesn't have to come out here. So that doesn't make it a very defined movement when you have this nice 1 acre smaller food plot, a 1/2 acre, 1/4 acre that you want to bring deer into, but they don't even have to come within 100 yards because they can look right in here. And that's a problem we have going on in this plot. I've tried to use Egyptian wheat the last couple of years in the screening, and for one, I'm not getting it in early enough. I tend to favor our other properties that are within eyesight of my house than coming down here, driving up in this hill, and taking the time, the hour and 15 minutes it gets to come down here. It doesn't seem like a lot of time, but you know, for something important, but it's just my time to work on the property when I involve everything else I do in my whitetail life and home life, and this property down here suffers a little bit. Really need to get switchgrass around here. We can switchgrass in the spring. I can frost seed. I can drill it in with our RTP, our Genesis drill from RTP. But once I have that screening around here, those bucks then have to walk through that screening into the plot to actually search this or get close to it and on the downwind side, which is where we have stands where we're hunting, to actually figure out if there's some does in here they need to check out. And it takes that aspect of them cruising by at 100, 150 yards away, 75 yards away, and it brings them right into this spot. So that helps define it next to the stand locations. Something a little bit less obvious and something that's critical to me. When you look back into the woods right back here, it's very open. How safe do you think a doe family group, let alone a buck, mature buck, young buck, feels bedding right next to this food source? Just in the brush, 20, 30, 40 yards. Now, mature bucks typically won't bed next to this food source anyways, so the most important aspect of building this food source is where do those does bed? Well, for right now, they don't feel safe until they're 100, 125 yards away, because that's where there starts to be cover that is actually secure and off this big open area where they can get back into some cover and they don't feel like they're staring across an opening here and right out in the open. By putting the screening cover here, now 20 yards right over there becomes a highly secure, and if you have in the case of switchgrass, it actually becomes a thermal area where a deer can get in behind that thermal layer, get out of the wind, and they can actually bed 20, 30 yards away. So what that does is if those does that are typically bedding 125 yards away, 150 yards down and over on the bench, if I can pull those doe family groups, because that's the first adequate cover, that's where they feel safe and away from this big opening. If I have switchgrass extended out here 20, 30 feet wide around this food plot, then they can feel safe just bedding 20 yards right over here. What that does, pulls the bedding opportunity that's 125 yards away, puts does right up against this food source. You know where they're going to be every time when you come out, in and out. If I was working on bedding areas, I'd work on those bedding areas for those does specifically. It all starts with doe bedding first, food source, doe bedding, And then what does that do? It frees up that 125 yards away or 150 yards away, that bedding area for bucks. That's how you start to layer deer bedding. Those mature bucks are not going to bed between the doe family groups and this food source. So once we get to where we're about 200 yards back from a food source, and that's assuming that you have the screening, you have the opportunity for doe bedding within the first 25 to 30 yards, then you have a few other layers of bedding, and finally when you get 200 yards back, you have that mature buck. Then he's close enough to actually relate to this food source on a daily basis and look at this as his preferred afternoon food source. Now obviously if those does aren't bedding until they're 125 yards back, that's that first adequate bedding area because it's open through here. Then it's possible those bucks are 400, 500, 600 yards away, at least to where they finally find an adequate location for them to bed and be far enough away from the does, far enough away from this food source. Those mature bucks are literally the back end of the daily movement. They're the ones that are further back. That's why they get to the fields latest too. They start moving about the same time as the does every afternoon. It takes them a while to get here. One of the problems when you don't have this screening is that you really don't create that opportunity where you can create that afternoon movement. So sure, a buck has to come through the screening, check out the entire food plot, see what's out here, see if there's does he wants to come check it out, or smaller bucks that he wants to mess with, or another dominant buck that he wants to tangle with. He has to come through this grass. Sure, it's great for hunter access here, but it all starts with the ladies. I see far too many times on the properties that I travel around the country, landowners focusing on a buck bed. And there's this big buck bed craze with the thought that you go in and make a buck bed and you're gonna have every buck in the woods trying to fight for this location. But if you don't have these food sources, for one, to define that daily afternoon movement, if you don't have the screening around the food source, and then that screening, if you don't have the screening to create the doe bedding just 20 to 40 yards in here, that first layer, then it's probable that you don't have those bucks that are 200, 300 yards back that focus on this food source every single day, because then it becomes more of a random mess. You pull bucks far enough away from this food source that it isn't part of their daily pattern. All starts with the food, the screening, the doe bed layer, maybe another doe bed layer, younger bucks, older bucks. In mixed ag area, you want to focus on that 300-400 yard window at most. When you get into northern Ohio, southern Michigan, maybe southern Wisconsin, northern Indiana, where it's open, there's not a lot of cover, you could expect to sandwich that movement within 150 to 200 yards at most, because deer are used to living on top of each other and they don't have a lot of cover available, so they have to sandwich in on top of each other. And then when you get into the northern wilderness areas, northern Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, I've seen movements that are 3/4 of a mile long every single day, where a mature buck is bedding that far back in the swamps, relating to food sources. In the case of the UP of Michigan, a lot of times bait piles in November, where you have does 200, 300 yards away. That's that first layer. And those bucks, especially the older bucks, are far behind that. And that's where they feel comfortable because they have space. And usually whitetails, when they have space, they actually take it. So define that daily movement, keep it solid. But most importantly, whether you have hunter access, you're forcing bucks out in here to look around, most importantly, you're creating those bedding layers, creating that opportunity for bedding, sandwiching that movement as best as you can within the smallest window as possible. That means that the deer are going to focus on your land every single day. And if you do that in this coming season, like we need to do around this food source right here, we've been a little bit neglectful in this one. We have to have that screening. We have to do a better job at it here. If you do that, then you can expect those deer to hit those food sources every single day of the season. You keep the food out here consistent, keep the cover over here from being overpressured. You'll contain that movement all season long. And folks, when I seen that happen, when I get to experience that myself and my clients do, it's an incredible opportunity that you have in the deer management world to define that daily movement, sandwich those layers of bedding, keep it consistent all season long. You're going to experience something that less than 1% of all whitetail land managers get to experience on an annual basis. It doesn't happen very often. Sometimes it happens by accident. I want you to actually plan for it this coming season.